So finishing up with the law of Moses, um, according to the rabbis, there is actually 613 laws in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses. Now, what we'll see as we go through this course is that as the law gets developed through the Talmud, through the oral system, and so forth, there's going to be thousands and thousands of permutations of each of these 613 laws. But the basis of really the Torah's covenant with the Jewish people is the 613 commandments as calculated here by the rabbis. Now, the law itself, the Torah itself, is actually, many parts of it are similar to some of the ancient legal codes, like the laws of Hammurabi from Babylon, which predated the law of Moses. And there's other law codes in the ancient world as well. But there were two very unique things about the Torah that were unlike anything else. And number one is that the Torah itself was God-oriented. In other words, unlike the other ancient legal systems, where the gods of the various nations would, they had nothing to do with the laws of the nations, of the individual nations. In other words, the king of a particular nation would issue laws, and it was simply a means to obeying the individual king. But the law of Moses, or the Torah, was unique in that the laws were connected to God. In other words, this was a way of showing fealty towards God or honor towards God, was by keeping his commandments. So everything about the Torah is centered on the Lord. That's number one. Number two is that the laws of the Torah were very humane in comparison to many of the other legal systems. If, for instance, you had to treat your slaves well, you had to treat your animals well. There were certain commandments like that. And so unlike some of the other legal systems, this was of the ancient world. This was very unique with respect to the laws of Moses. But really, in conclusion with all of this, the idea of the law of Moses, these laws, was to keep the Jewish people together, to make them as a holy nation, to enable them to represent and to model the character of God among all of the people. And what's really amazing is that even to this day, many Jewish people feel honor and respect towards the Torah. Many, especially in the Orthodox community, still attempt to keep it. And this was again given 3,500 years ago, and yet there's still this testimony of obedience to something that was given by God so long ago. It shows the lasting, the forever, the endurance really of the laws that were given at Mount Sinai by God to his people, to the Jewish people. Well, what happens next? What next is that now that the people of Israel have the laws of God, now they have to get the land, and so they under Joshua, they're called to go in and to conquer the land of Canaan. Each tribe is given special kind of regions around the land of Canaan in the Middle East. And so you can see on your maps here that each of these portions, this is not broken out in boundaries, but these are the general areas of where the various tribes were. So you have up in the north, Asher and Naphtali, and in the south, you have Judea, Shimon or Simeon, and spread around. That was the goal. They were to go in and to conquer and destroy all the Canaanite tribes. And there's a whole story behind that. These were tribes that were originally descendants of one of Noah's grandsons, Canaan, who was cursed because he apparently did something to Noah, and as a result of that, his descendants were cursed, and those particular tribes were the ones that were going to be destroyed in the land of Canaan. But the tribes that were not allowed to be touched when the Israelites went into the land were the Moabites, the Ammonites, and the Edomites. The reason was these were all descendants and connected to Abraham. And because of that, God had a special covenant with Abraham. And even though they were not under the special covenant that was granted also to Isaac and Jacob, because they were connected to Abraham in some way, the Israelites had to leave them alone. So when you read through the book of Joshua, you see that these particular groups were left alone. Well, what happens is once the land is conquered, Israel is really not a national country. It's really more of a kind of a confederation of tribes. And loyalty was primarily focused on the tribal loyalty, kind of the elders of the tribe. And you see this particularly in the book of Judges, where you have different judges arise who are essentially like tribal leaders or tribal warriors who joined together with some of the other tribes to defend the borders against incursions by foreign entities. But it's not a very effective way of defense. It's not a unified country. In fact, those of you familiar with American history, it would be comparable to the old Articles of Confederation before the American Constitution was developed in the United States. Kind of a confederation, loose confederation of states. This is really what it was like in that particular time in Israel. And so what happened, and you can see also up here, the major enemies on the map are the Philistines, which were located like on the western part of the country along the Mediterranean Sea. They were located particularly in Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza. It's known as Gaza here, but Gaza Strip today, of course, well known because of the Palestinians. But these were the Philistines, and I should have said this earlier, but I'll say it now. There's been some argument that the Palestinians are descendants of the Philistines, and the Philistines predated the Israelites. In other words, the Philistines were in the land of Canaan before the Israelites. And so if the Palestinians are actually descendants of the Philistines, then maybe they do have an entitlement to the land. I mean, the Jews, in part, claim their entitlement to the land because they were there first. In other words, they were there and God gave them that land. But if the Palestinians were really there first, or their ancestors were, then maybe they should be there. But it's a complete misreading of the scriptures, because what the reality is that the Philistines were actually the direct descendants of Ham or Ham. In other words, they were part of the kind of the African peoples. That was really their descendancy. The Palestinians are Semites. They're Arabs. In other words, they come through Shem. They're cousins of the Jewish people. And so the descendancy of the Philistines and the Palestinians are completely different. They're totally different races. There's absolutely no connection whatsoever. And the reality is that the Philistines were wiped out long, long ago, and their descendants don't really exist any longer. Most scholars consider them to be what's called sea people. They originally came from Crete, out in the Mediterranean, relocated along the coast of Israel. And of course, they become a significant player in early Israelite history, all the way up to the time of David, when they're finally ultimately defeated. But that's those group of people. Well, what happens is, especially as you're going through the book of Judges, and maybe I should have been providing you some dates here, but to give you a little bit of a date line, if we look at Abraham, he lived around the year 1800 BCE. Moses, around 1400 BC, where the Exodus occurred. We get to the book of Joshua and then Judges. Now we're looking probably in the 1100s, 1100s, something like that. And in the book of Judges, again, as I've already described, they were constantly having to fend off these attacks by various other nations. And so the people were crying out. They wanted a national leader. They wanted a king like the other nations had, which is really what the book of Samuel is kind of about, as they're calling out Samuel as the first major prophet to arise, and they're calling out to him, give us a king. And so with Samuel and with around the year 1000 or maybe 1050, you have the rise of the kings of Israel. And so what happens in Israel's society for the next 500 years is you have a kind of a threefold leadership system. In one sense, it was like a checks and balances, like you would have in modern governments today. You had the kings. They would be the executive branch. They would be the military leaders. That's one category of folks. And then you'd have the prophets. They were like social reformers. They were the ones who would call the people to account. They would challenge the kings, kind of keep them in check. When things went awry, they weren't following the Lord. They weren't treating people justly. They were mistreating the poor. They were expropriating other people's lands, so on. And so they act as kind of a social conscience on the society. And then you had the priests. The priests were, obviously, they functioned in the priesthood as the religious leaders, but they were the judges. They were the teachers of the land. And so they created kind of a judicial system as well. And so what you have, again, is, like I said, a kind of checks and balances in early Israelite society, so that when somebody got out of line, like one of the kings became evil, the prophets and the priests could rise up and try to bring him back in line. And so there was this tug of war going on in early Israelite society between various power factions. Well, again, around the year 1050, you have the first king. That's King Saul. And of course, we know from the story that he fails. But what you have following him is considered the kind of the preeminent king of Israel. the example from all other kings and following, that is King David. And we want to look at the next map for our David experience. Now, David, again, for those of you familiar with American history, he's like the George Washington figure of Israel. In other words, becomes the father of national Israel. He's the one that really coalesces the nation around about him, and so they no longer is this tribal kind of group, but now you've got a national country following a leader. And as I said, he becomes the kind of the picture of the ideal king throughout the scriptures. The prophets who come later after him always look back at David as being this kind of idyllic period when there was expansion of land, there was military victories, there was prosperity, there was peace. I mean, this was the perfect period. And in fact, as the prophets developed the theme of the Messiah that we'll come to a little bit later, the Messiah is often pictured as a direct kind of image of David, a descendant of David specifically, but also, in fact, even some of the prophets describe the Messiah will be David. He's like a David-like figure because he's such the ideal king. And he expands the boundaries of the land of Israel to really their farthest points, him and his son Solomon. And so it's a little tricky on this map, but the light blue up here is essentially the extent of David's boundaries, David and Solomon. And these boundaries were what was promised to Abraham in the very beginning. God promised Abraham, I believe it was in Genesis chapter 15, a certain boundaries. And then he promised it later to Moses, then later to Joshua. Well, it's only under David and Solomon's reign that Israel actually reaches those boundary markers. And now what's a little bit interesting about this, a fun fact to know and tell, is you'll see that the boundaries of David were right along here, kind of in the middle of the Sinai desert. The boundaries in the scriptures say that the southern boundary of Israel, southwestern boundary, was the river of Egypt. Some people thought, well, the river of Egypt must be the Nile River. But the reality is that's not the case. The river of Egypt was a little wadi. In other words, it's a little river in the Sinai Peninsula right along this area right in here. Now, the reason I'm saying it's a fun fact to know and tell is that in the 1967 war between Israel and the surrounding Arab nations, Israel conquered the entire Sinai Peninsula right here from the Egyptians. And so, and of course, has held much of the Arab lands ever since then. But in 1977, in a peace treaty with Egypt, the leader of Israel, Menachem Begin, gave up much of the Sinai. And people can say, well, how could he give up all this land? Because I mean, this land was profitable land. I mean, there's a lot of oil in those lands that he actually gave up. What he gave up, interestingly, was up to the river of Egypt, because Menachem Begin wanted to keep the country within biblical boundaries. And so he gave up land that had not been given to Israel in the beginning. And that was the case. Now, the West Bank, which is this area right in here, belongs to the Jewish people. That belongs to the promises of God. And so that God promised. So that's a different story. But that is another a fun fact to know and tell. Now, during Solomon's reign, the word Solomon, Shlomo, comes from the Hebrew word shalom, and it means peace. And he was really named this because he becomes really a king that brings peace to the nation. During that time, Israel really reached the kind of the apogee of its existence. I mean, it was a time of great prosperity. They had trade all throughout the Middle East. The scripture said that the silver was so plentiful in the land of Israel that it became almost worthless because they had so many riches in the land. This was where the image that the scriptures describe of Israel becoming the central focus for the nations, where they would come to learn of the ways of God. This existed during this period, as described in the book of Kings and Chronicles, where the people of the nations would come up and they would experience the reality of God. There's a story in Kings about the Queen of Sheba coming down from this area, maybe in here, this like what today might be Saudi Arabia. She comes up and she is marveled by what she sees in in Israel and in the peace, and she explains this to Solomon, and he talks to her about this. This is the God of Israel. This is what God has provided for us, and she's completely wowed and amazed. And this is an example of really what God had planned for Israel all along, that they would become the example to the nations, that people would want to emulate their type of life, that they would come to know the God of Israel. This was really the goal, and this was what was happening at this particular time. So what's interesting is following this period, of course, Israel begins to decline in power, but the prophets later who write look back at this period as the idyllic period. They reflect this as, and the images are very, very powerful, especially in Isaiah, where it talks about in the end days that the nations will come to Jerusalem and they will worship the Lord, and the law will go out from Zion to the nations. And really what they're doing is they're simply looking back at this period of David and Solomon, and they're reflecting it forward to the Messianic kingdom, when this actually will happen all over the earth. So this is really the ideal period when Israel reaches its greatest political power, greatest period of spirituality, greatest economic power. This is the ideal, kind of the golden age of Israel. It lasted from about 1000 BCE to about 910, thereabout, and that was that significant period. Well, what happens next, those of you that know the scriptures, of course, we see that Solomon near the end of his life starts to really deteriorate spiritually. He begins to marry foreign wives. They cause him to follow other gods. And God says that he's going to bring judgment upon Israel because of their straying after these foreign gods. And the Lord specifically says that the judgment won't happen during Solomon's reign, but it will happen in the reign of his son. And so sure enough, Solomon dies. New son takes over power, Rehoboam. He becomes the king. He's kind of a loser. And so another person from another tribe by the name of Jeroboam, who happened to have been an assistant to Solomon, rises up in rebellion against Rehoboam and creates a civil war. And so Israel splits into two nations. They fight one another, and then they finally come to kind of an armistice of sorts, not really peace, but more of an armistice, ceasefire. And the northern, what's known as the 10 northern tribes of Israel, collect together and become known as the Kingdom of Israel, or the tribes of the north. And so you see on the map here, this red area right here is the Kingdom of Israel, which begins probably around the year 900, 890 BCE, and continues on for about another 160 plus 170 years as a separate kingdom. And then you have the southern kingdom, the Kingdom of Judah, which is comprised mainly of Judah, Benjamin, and the Levites. They kind of join together and make this separate nation. Now, according to the scriptures, these all of the kings of the north, the kings of the northern kingdom, Israel, are all evil. In other words, they turn against God. They serve idols. But many of the kings of the south, the kings of Judah, are actually godly people, and continue the stream of the house of David, the stream of godliness throughout. But the problem, of course, is that now with the kingdom split, it creates weakness, where Israel had been, fairly significant regional power back in the 900s. By the 800s, they're declining in power because of the split, and now other countries begin to attack them and to begin to take certain parts of their lands and subjugate them. And this is the beginning, really, of the rise of the prophetic age, kind of the rise of the well-known prophets. So you get the rise of the 800s of Elijah and Elisha, who primarily are prophets against the kings of the north. You see that. And then you also have the rise of other foreign powers that begin to attack Israel. And one of those powers is the nation of Aram, A-R-A-M, or today would be known as the nation of Syria. And so that would be right up in this area right in here. This would be the country of Aram. And then you also have another really very major empire that arises during the same period, and that's our next slide here. This is the empire of Assyria, which is centered in Nineveh, which is up on the Tigris River, right on this map here in the kind of the northern part, which would today be kind of northern Iraq. And this was the capital of the Assyrian Empire. And so what you see is we're going to look at a scripture here, look at a passage of scripture to see the interplay between these various kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Judah, the prophets, and these other nations, Aram and Assyria. So want to turn our attention to the prophet of Isaiah. So Isaiah lived in the his ministry started around the 740s. And so this is about when he's prophesying right now, 740s, 730s, somewhere in that era. And we look at Isaiah chapter 7 for this period, and let's look at it because it's going to describe, again, the interaction among all these nations. So let's look at it. It says, when Ahaz, the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, was king of Judah. Now that, again, we'll look backwards on our map here. King of Judah is the southern kingdom up here, this one right in here. It says, was king of Judah, and the king Razin of Aram, again, that's the king in the north, doesn't say it up here, but that's the country in the north. It says, and Pekah, son of Remaliah, king of Israel, marched up to fight against Jerusalem, but they could not overpower it. So basically what happened was there was an alliance between Aram and the kingdom of Israel to attack the kingdom of Judah and defeat it, to overthrow this country, and to really overthrow the king of David, the descendancy of David. So let's see what happens. It says in verse 2, now the house of David was told, Aram has allied itself with Ephraim. Ephraim is another name for the kingdom of Israel. That was the leading tribe of the kingdom of Israel. So the hearts of Ahaz and his people were shaken as the deep trees of the forest are shaken by the wind. Now then the Lord said to Isaiah, go out, you and your son Shear-Shabab, to meet Ahaz at the end of the aqueduct of the upper pool on the road to the waterman's field, and say to him, be careful, keep calm, and don't be afraid. Do not lose heart because of these two smoldering stubs of firewood, because of the fierce anger of Razin of Aram and the son of Amaliah. Aram, Ephraim, and Remaliah's son have plotted your ruin, saying, let us invade Judah, let us tear it apart and divide it among ourselves, and make the son of Tabil king over it. Now that would mean that the descendancy of David would be destroyed. In other words, there'd be a new king, a foreign king would take over Judah. And yet this is what the Lord says, it will not take place, it will not happen. For the head of Aram is Damascus, that's Syria, and the head of Damascus is only Razin. Within 65 years, Ephraim, or kingdom of Israel, will be shattered to be a people. The head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is only Remaliah's son. If you do not stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all. And again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz. As the Lord your God, ask the Lord your God for a sign, whether the deepest depths or in the highest heights. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, and I'll not put the Lord to the test. This is a sign of whether the Lord is really going to abide by his word, and that the kingdom of Judah will not be defeated. So he says, this is what Isaiah says. Hear now, you house of David, it is not enough to try the patience of men. Will you try the patience of my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will be with child and will give birth as a son, and will call him Emmanuel. He'll eat curds and honey when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. But before the boy knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, the land of the two kings you dread will be laid waste. The Lord will bring on you and your people and on the house of your father a time unlike any since Ephraim broke away from Judah. He will bring the king of Assyria. So what's this all about? This becomes hugely important. Basically, what the Lord is promising him is saying, look, you're not going to be defeated. These guys aren't going to take you out, but rather I'm going to give you a sign. And the sign is that a virgin is going to give birth, and the virgin's son will be called Emmanuel. Well, what's so interesting about this? Because Ahaz does not have a son that's named Emmanuel. And there's nothing really in this story. But what's interesting about it, if you look in the Hebrew, you don't see it in the English or in the other languages, but in the Hebrew, you will see it. When God is speaking to Ahaz, and he says, you, Israel, will not be defeated, it's in the plural. But when he says specifically to Ahaz that the Lord is going to give you a sign, it's in the singular. In other words, you as the king are going to give a sign. And the sign is going to be, there's one who is going to come as a result of a miracle, and who's going to ultimately be known as God is with us, Emmanuel. In other words, it's God's promise to Ahaz that your king, that your descendancy will not be destroyed until the one who comes, who's going to sit on David's throne and is going to bring Israel to her glory and is going to enable all the nations to recognize Israel's glory through this one to come. That will happen, and you will not be defeated. And ultimately, your enemies will be defeated within the next few years, and so you have nothing to fear at all. Of course, what it is, it's ultimately the promise of the coming one, the promise of the Messiah. We'll pick up with this in our next session.